They thought he was just a mechanic, someone who fixed engines and kept machines running smoothly behind the scenes. Nobody expected him to be the hero that day, the one who would face a raging blizzard, take control of a failing plane, and save everyone on board. It started like any other winter morning, cold and quiet, but soon everything changed. The storm was coming faster and fiercer than anyone had predicted. People were rushing to get home, flights were delayed, and the airport was buzzing with nervous energy. Among the crowd, there was a man who blended into the background, wearing grease-stained overalls, his hands rough from years of work. To most, he was just a mechanic, the kind of person you see fixing a plane's engine and then quietly moving on. But he carried a secret no one suspected. As the blizzard closed in, a plane waiting on the runway was suddenly caught in trouble. The storm was worse than anyone had imagined, the kind of weather that could turn a routine flight into a nightmare. Panic began to spread among the crew and passengers. The pilots were struggling to keep the plane stable, their voices tight with tension as they battled wind and ice. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and hope seemed to be slipping away with every gust of the howling storm. Then, in the middle of the chaos, that quiet mechanic stepped forward. No one expected what would happen next. You see, beneath the oily jumpsuit and the calm, unassuming demeanor was a man with an incredible past, a hidden skill that would soon turn the entire situation upside down. His knowledge went far beyond fixing engines. It was a skill that had been tested under pressure, in moments that demanded more than just technical know-how. But why had no one ever known? And how would he manage to take charge in the face of such a terrifying blizzard? The answer to that would change everything for the people on that plane, and for the mechanic himself. The tension was rising as the storm raged outside, making every second feel like an eternity. Passengers gripped their seats, some praying, others frozen in fear. The crew worked frantically, trying to communicate with air traffic control, but the blizzard had disrupted nearly all signals. The runway was slick with ice, and the wind was so strong it felt like it could rip the plane apart. Just when it seemed like there was no way out, that mechanic, the one no one had really paid attention to, made a move that shocked everyone. It wasn't just about fixing a broken machine anymore. It was about stepping up in a moment when lives were on the line. What happened next was something that no one saw coming. It wasn't just a matter of skill, it was courage, quick thinking, and an unbreakable spirit. This was a man who, until that moment, had been invisible to most people. But now, he was about to become the reason everyone would live to tell the story. The blizzard wasn't just a backdrop, it was an enemy, a force that pushed them all to the edge. And the mechanic's true test had only just begun. As the plane struggled against the howling winds and thick snow, the question on everyone's mind was simple but terrifying. Would they make it through the storm? And could the man they thought was just a mechanic really be their only hope? The answer hung in the freezing air, just out of reach, as the storm closed in and the plane fought for its survival. You might be wondering how someone so unexpected could take control in such a desperate moment. What was his story? How did he come to have the skills to fly a plane when the pilots couldn't? And what had led him to that airport on that cold, stormy day? The truth is, this isn't just a story about a blizzard or a broken plane. It's about the hidden depths in people we often overlook, about bravery when no one is watching, and about the moments that reveal who we really are. Stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. The storm is still raging, and the next moments will decide everything. You're about to hear how a man who was thought to be nothing more than a mechanic stepped into the cockpit, faced the fury of nature, and fought to save everyone on board. But will it be enough? Will they make it out alive? That's what we're going to find out, and you won't want to miss a single second. No one could have guessed what that mechanic's life had been like before that snowy day. Most people saw him as just part of the airport crew, the guy who quietly made sure planes ran without a hitch. But beneath that calm surface was a story filled with surprising twists and years of hidden skill. Before he ever set foot in the airport hangar, he had a different life, one that few knew about and even fewer expected. He wasn't always a mechanic. In fact, flying had been his first love. He had grown up watching planes soar across the sky, dreaming of the day he could pilot one himself. But life had thrown curveballs, financial struggles, family responsibilities, and moments where he had to put those dreams aside to make ends meet. So instead of becoming a pilot, he learned the next best thing: how to keep those flying machines alive. He became an expert at fixing engines, reading every manual, understanding every bolt and wire. His hands knew planes like no one else's, and over time, his knowledge grew far beyond just repair. Yet there was something else, something almost nobody knew. In the quiet hours away from the hangar, he kept up with flying lessons, practicing in simulators, and studying weather patterns. He was preparing for a chance to fly again, even if no one believed it would happen. It was a secret passion, a dream held close to his heart, waiting for the right moment to come alive. And then the blizzard struck. As the storm built up power outside, he watched from the hangar, his instincts telling him something was wrong. When the call came that the flight crew was struggling, and the plane was caught in the thick of the storm with a failing engine, he didn't hesitate. This was the moment he had prepared for, even if no one else knew it yet. He stepped toward the chaos, a quiet confidence in his eyes, but inside, his heart was pounding. This wasn't just about flying. It was about facing fear head-on, about proving to himself and everyone else that he was more than just a mechanic. Inside the plane, the passengers had no idea what was about to happen. They were tense, whispering prayers and hoping for a miracle. The pilots were fighting the controls, their faces pale as the storm battered the aircraft. Outside, the snow whipped like a wild beast, obscuring everything in a whiteout that made every decision critical. The airport staff on the ground could only watch, helpless, as the plane struggled to stay on course. Meanwhile, the mechanic was making his way through the airport, dodging rushing travelers and piled-up snow. Every step brought him closer to the cockpit, and closer to the moment where his hidden skills would be tested like never before. He knew the risks. Flying in a blizzard was one of the most dangerous things anyone could do. But he also knew that if he didn't try, the chances of everyone surviving would be slim. There was a quiet determination in his mind, a steady calm despite the storm raging all around. He remembered the countless hours of practice, the moments when he had flown through simulated storms, and the times he had imagined this exact scenario. Now, the fantasy was real, and he had no choice but to act. At the same time, the crew inside the plane was starting to realize help was on the way. But would it come in time? And would the person stepping into the pilot's seat be ready for what was ahead? The tension inside the cabin was thick, each second filled with uncertainty and hope. Outside, the blizzard showed no sign of easing. The wind howled like a warning, ice clung to every surface, and the sky seemed to close in. It was a fight against nature itself, and no one knew how it would end. But one thing was clear: the man who had been overlooked, underestimated, and hidden in plain sight was about to change everything. The question now wasn't just whether the plane could survive the storm. It was whether this mechanic, this secret pilot, could find a way to save them all, or if the blizzard would claim them before the true story even had a chance to unfold. The plane's cabin was filled with nervous whispers and quiet sobs as the storm battered the fuselage. Passengers clutched their armrests, eyes darting to the windows where swirling snow and darkness blurred the outside world. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering calm words that did little to ease the rising fear. In the cockpit, the pilots' faces were tight with stress, their hands gripping controls as they fought to keep the plane steady against the blizzard's fury. But then, a voice crackled over the radio, barely audible through the static. It was the mechanic. His calm but firm tone cut through the tension like a lifeline. "I'm coming up," he said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Back on the ground, the airport staff scrambled to clear the snow and keep runways as safe as possible. The storm had caused delays and cancellations all day, turning the normally bustling airport into a chaotic scene of worried travelers and exhausted workers. Among them was a young air traffic controller, watching the radar screen with growing concern. She had noticed something unusual about the plane's movements, subtle shifts in direction, moments when it seemed the aircraft was struggling against more than just the weather. Her fingers hovered over the emergency frequency button, ready to send out a distress call. But something about the mechanic's voice gave her a glimmer of hope, even if she didn't fully understand what was happening yet. Inside the plane, the mechanic was making his way to the cockpit through narrow aisles, dodging frightened passengers and worried crew. Some looked at him with surprise. Who was this man stepping into a pilot's role? Others simply clung to whatever hope they could find. As he reached the cockpit door, the pilots glanced up, relief and skepticism mixing in their eyes. They had been trained for emergencies, but this was something different. This was a stranger stepping in, someone they hadn't expected. Yet they had no choice. The blizzard was relentless, and the plane needed every bit of skill it could get. Meanwhile, deeper inside the plane, two passengers were locked in their own struggle. A father held his young daughter tightly, whispering stories to distract her from the storm outside. The girl's wide eyes reflected fear, but also a trust in her dad's voice. Nearby, an elderly woman clutched a faded photograph, her hands trembling as she silently prayed. Their stories were part of the larger tapestry of lives hanging in the balance, ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. As the mechanic settled into the pilot's seat, he quickly assessed the situation. The instruments were coated with ice, some readings flickering uncertainly. Communication with the ground was spotty at best. The plane's engines were struggling, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. His hands moved instinctively over the controls, every decision critical. He had trained for this, but training was one thing, the reality was something else entirely. Outside, the wind screamed louder, whipping the snow into blinding sheets. The runway lights were barely visible through the storm's whiteout. Back in the control tower, the young air traffic controller gripped the edge of her desk, heart pounding. She watched the plane's progress with a mix of hope and dread, knowing that any misstep could mean disaster. Back in the cockpit, the mechanic's mind raced. He had to keep the plane steady, guide it safely through the storm, and find a way to land on a runway that was nearly invisible. Every movement mattered. He could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on him. The blizzard was more than just weather, it was a test of courage, skill, and determination. And as the plane began its slow, trembling descent through the storm, the question remained, would the man they thought was just a mechanic be enough to bring them all home? Or was the blizzard about to claim another victim? The answer was still out there, lost in the roar of the wind and the swirling snow, waiting to be revealed. The plane trembled like a leaf in a storm as it struggled through the thick curtain of snow and ice. Inside the cockpit, the mechanic's hands were steady but his mind was racing. Every gauge, every flicker of a warning light, demanded his full attention. The blizzard outside wasn't just a challenge, it was a force pushing against him, trying to shake the plane loose from control. The roar of the wind was deafening, drowning out the steady hum of the engines. The windows were glazed with frost, making the world outside a blur of white chaos. Passengers gripped their seats harder, sensing the tension even if they couldn't see it. Whispered prayers and soft sobs filled the cabin, mingling with the faint creaks and groans of the aircraft battling the elements. The father continued to soothe his daughter, his voice barely audible over the storm, while the elderly woman clutched her photograph tighter, her knuckles white with fear. Everyone was holding on, waiting for something, anything, that would bring hope. Back at the airport, the young air traffic controller was glued to her radar screen, eyes flicking between the plane's blinking icon and the weather reports flashing urgent warnings. Her fingers hovered nervously over the radio, ready to issue emergency instructions if needed. She had never felt the weight of a single flight so heavily on her shoulders. The storm was relentless, and with every passing minute, the window for a safe landing grew smaller. The runway lights flickered through the snow, barely visible like faint stars fighting against the storm's fury. In the cockpit, the mechanic adjusted the controls carefully, his breath steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. His training kicked in, guiding him through the complex dance of flying in whiteout conditions. But this wasn't a simulation. This was real life, with real people depending on him. The engine warnings that had started as flickers now glowed brighter, reminders that time was running out. Ice was building on the wings, threatening lift, and the plane's instruments occasionally flickered, as if the storm was trying to confuse him. Suddenly, a jolt shook the plane violently, throwing the cockpit into chaos for a moment. The mechanic's heart leapt, but his hands didn't waver. He fought to steady the aircraft, battling the invisible grip of the storm. The wind screamed like a wild animal outside, pressing against the metal frame as if it wanted to tear the plane apart. The pilots who had just stepped aside watched in tense silence, their faith in the mechanic growing with each passing second. Down in the cabin, the tension was palpable. The father's voice faltered as his daughter's grip tightened, eyes wide with terror. Flight attendants moved quickly, their faces pale but resolute, trying to keep calm while fear clawed at them. Every passenger felt it, the edge of disaster brushing against their lives, the thin line between safety and tragedy. They had put their trust in the hands of a man they barely knew, and now all they could do was hold on. Outside, the blizzard showed no mercy. The snow swirled in furious spirals, blocking the view of the runway almost completely. The young air traffic controller's voice came through the radio, calm but urgent, giving final clearance for landing and reminding the mechanic to trust his instruments. Her eyes never left the screen, willing the plane to make it through. Inside the cockpit, the mechanic took a deep breath, preparing for the most dangerous part, the descent and landing. Every move had to be perfect. One wrong turn, one missed signal, and the plane could slide off the icy runway or worse. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. He could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on him like a heavy storm cloud. The plane lowered slowly, wobbling in the wind. The runway lights flickered closer, then vanished behind the snow again. The engines groaned under the strain, and the warning alarms flashed in warning. The mechanic's eyes burned with focus, muscles tight, every sense sharpened by the crisis. Outside, the storm's roar seemed to grow louder, as if daring him to fail. In that moment, everything was uncertain. The storm was relentless, the plane fragile, and the people inside terrified but hoping. The man they thought was just a mechanic was about to face the hardest test of his life. And what happened next would decide not just their fate, but how they'd all be remembered. Just as the mechanic's hand steadied the controls, and the plane began its slow, trembling approach toward the barely visible runway, an unexpected alarm sounded. It wasn't one of the usual warnings about ice buildup or engine strain. This was different. A deep, urgent beep that sent a chill through the cockpit. The instruments flickered wildly, and the control panel's lights danced like a warning storm of their own. The mechanic's heart sank. Something was seriously wrong. He glanced quickly at the gauges, searching for answers. One engine had dropped sharply in power. The blizzard's fury hadn't just battered the plane, it had damaged critical systems. The engines were no longer working in sync. The strain on the aircraft had just doubled. It was a complication no one had anticipated, not the pilots, not the crew, and certainly not the passengers. The mechanic's calm exterior cracked for a brief moment as the reality hit him. The storm wasn't the only enemy now. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the sudden lurch. Drinks spilled, children cried out, and the father clutched his daughter tighter, whispering reassurances he barely believed himself. The elderly woman's prayers became desperate murmurs, and the flight attendants exchanged worried glances. The tension that had already filled the air now thickened to an almost suffocating weight. What was happening up front? Why had the plane just shuddered like that? On the ground, the air traffic controller caught the sudden drop in the plane's altitude and erratic movements on her radar. Her fingers trembled as she tried to re-establish clearer communication, but the storm was interfering, and the radio crackled with static. She called out to the mechanic's last known frequency, but only faint, broken responses came back. The stakes had skyrocketed. The plane wasn't just fighting the blizzard anymore, it was fighting failure from within. In the cockpit, the mechanic took a deep breath and quickly ran through emergency procedures he had memorized but never had to fully use. His voice was calm but firm as he radioed the control tower, explaining the engine trouble and his plan to manually stabilize the plane. It was a desperate move, but the only one he had. Time was running out, and every second felt like a lifetime. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, the unexpected happened. The plane's navigation system, vital for guiding the landing in near-zero visibility, began to fail. The screens flickered and then went dark. The blizzard wasn't just an external threat now, it had compromised the very instruments the plane relied on to survive. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, but the mechanic forced himself to stay focused. Without navigation, the chance of safely finding the runway was razor-thin. Back in the cabin, the passengers began to sense the gravity of the situation. The father whispered tighter to his daughter, trying to keep her calm, while flight attendants moved swiftly, preparing everyone for a rough landing. Murmurs of fear spread like wildfire, but somewhere inside that chaos, a quiet hope lingered, a hope in the man at the controls who had already done the impossible once that day. Outside, the storm roared louder than ever, as if sensing the crisis and intensifying its grip. The plane wobbled through the frozen wind, each moment pushing it closer to disaster or salvation. The air traffic controller's eyes never left her radar, tracking the plane's erratic path, heart pounding with every shift. She sent out updates and encouragement, but deep down, she knew the real test was in the cockpit, in the hands of the man who had gone from mechanic to unlikely hero. The blizzard wasn't just weather now, it was a beast clawing at the plane, trying to bring it down. The failing engines, the dead navigation, the frozen windows, all combined to create a nightmare scenario. The mechanic's grip on the controls tightened, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Every decision mattered, every movement could mean the difference between life and death. The plane dipped again, caught in a sudden gust. The runway lights flickered in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. The final, most dangerous moments were closing in fast. The man they had underestimated was facing a storm far bigger than anyone could imagine. The question now wasn't just if he could land the plane, it was if he could survive the blizzard's deadly grip long enough to do it. The plane shook violently as it descended through the howling blizzard, every fiber of its metal frame groaning under the strain. Inside the cockpit, the mechanic's hands moved with unwavering precision, guiding the aircraft inch by inch toward the runway that barely existed beneath the swirling snow. The engines faltered but didn't fail, their weakened roar a grim reminder of the battle raging both inside and outside the plane. With the navigation system dead, the mechanic relied on his instincts, and the faint runway lights struggling to cut through the whiteout. Sweat trickled down his forehead, his breath steady but shallow, every sense razor-sharp. The passengers braced themselves as the plane dipped and swayed, the landing gears scraping over icy patches and the runway's uneven surface. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin. The plane had touched down, but barely. The father squeezed his daughter's hand, a shaky sigh escaping both as the aircraft skidded sideways on the slick ground. Outside, the blizzard howled like a wild beast, but inside, a fragile hope was igniting. The mechanic fought to keep control, steering the plane through the blinding snow toward safety. With a final shudder and a burst of effort, the plane came to a stop, the engines sputtering in protest. Silence settled over the cabin for a moment before a wave of relief and applause erupted. Passengers hugged each other, tears flowing freely as they realized they had survived the impossible. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering comforting smiles and checking on everyone. The young air traffic controller, still watching from the tower, allowed herself a small smile of triumph. The mechanic, the man no one expected, had saved them all. But just as the tension began to ease, the cockpit door opened, revealing a second, unexpected figure. A uniformed pilot stepped forward, a look of disbelief on his face. "What happened here?" he asked, voice low but urgent. The mechanic's eyes met his, and in that moment, the truth came crashing down. The pilot wasn't just a relief crew sent for backup, he was the original captain who had disappeared hours earlier, lost in the storm. The emergency calls, the radio's silence, all signs pointed to him being gone. But now, he was here, alive and safe, thanks to the mechanic's quick thinking. The twist hit everyone like a lightning strike. The man they thought was just a mechanic had done more than repair planes. He had flown one through a deadly blizzard, saved lives, and rewritten what it meant to be a hero. The storm hadn't just tested the plane, it had uncovered the truth about a man who refused to be underestimated. And as the snow finally began to lighten outside, the story was far from over. Because in the quiet after the storm, new questions rose, about the pilot's disappearance, about the secret the mechanic had kept, and about what the future held for both men. The blizzard had passed, but its mysteries were only just beginning. As the storm finally began to ease, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone like a quiet calm after a long, fierce battle. Passengers were slowly disembarking, their faces still pale but filled with gratitude. The mechanic, now at the center of attention, stepped out of the cockpit, no longer invisible or underestimated. People surrounded him with questions and thanks, amazed at how the man they thought was just a mechanic had stepped up and flown a plane through one of the most dangerous blizzards in recent memory. The captain, the man who had been missing and presumed lost in the storm, sat quietly nearby, recovering from the ordeal. When the mechanic approached him, there was a deep respect exchanged, two men bound by an unspoken understanding of what it means to fight against the odds. The pilot admitted he had been caught in the storm earlier and was unable to make contact, which is why the mechanic had to take control. But instead of competition or jealousy, there was admiration. The mechanic's skills, determination, and calm under pressure had saved them all. Back at the airport, the young air traffic controller was praised for her quick thinking and calm coordination during the crisis. She had stayed focused when others might have lost hope. The entire crew, from flight attendants to ground staff, had worked together in an emergency that tested every skill they had. It was a reminder that in moments of crisis, teamwork and trust are what truly save lives. For the passengers, the day would never be forgotten. Stories of fear, courage, and survival would be shared for years to come. But more importantly, they would remember the lesson that heroes don't always wear uniforms or hold the titles we expect. Sometimes, they are the quiet ones working behind the scenes, waiting for the moment to step into the light. As the snow melted and normal life slowly returned, the mechanic's story spread, a powerful reminder of courage, resilience, and the unexpected ways ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges. It wasn't just about flying a plane through a blizzard, it was about hope and faith in the human spirit. And in the end, that's what stayed with everyone who heard the story, the idea that no matter the storm, there is always someone ready to fly into the danger, not because they have to, but because they believe it's worth saving every life.